We will be talking about the origin of species. Nature is discontinuous. Individuals fall into distinct groups. A wildcat can be seen as a lion, a tiger, a cougar, or a snow leopard. Although they all are clustered in the same group, they remain discrete. Clusters can be seen as species. What do species represent? One way to represent species is as a group of individuals that resemble each other more than they resemble members of other groups. This is called the morphological species concept. For example, a tiger can be represented as a group of cats in Asia whose adults are more than 5 feet long with vertical stripes and an orange body. Defining species by their morphological features is problematic. It's problematic because some species are sexually dimorphic and males and females can look different. For example, the male peacock is blue and has green, bright feathers. In contrast, the female is small and has brown feathers. It is also problematic in species that can have different features. For example, humans can have blue eyes, green eyes, or brown eyes, but they are all sexually reproductive with each other. Species can also look either exactly alike or nearly alike. This is a cryptic form. For Drosophila. Drosophila are cryptic because they include 9 species where females can't be told apart. They coexist in the same area but never exchange genes, and aka they don't hybridize. They are reproductively isolated from one another, and they constitute distinct gene pools that don't intermingle. Cryptic forms are distinct. The biological species concept, BSC. Species are distinct not just because they look different, but because there are barriers between them that prevent interbreeding. This concept is a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from one another. Why are species reproductively isolated? Examples of why species are reproductively isolated. One example is that mating or flowering seasons don't overlap. For example, a particular coral can reproduce one night a year, in contrast to its closely related species that reproduce at different times. Isolating barriers after mating. For example, pollen from one plant might fail to germinate the pistil of another. Fetuses are formed, but they might die before birth. Example, a sheep and a goat mix. The fetus dies. Hybrids can be sterile, like a mule, which is a horse and a donkey mixed. Several of these isolating barriers can act together. BSC is not perfect. Extinct organisms are not accounted for. They cannot be tested for reproductive compatibility, therefore they are tested by traditional fossil appearances. Organisms that reproduce asexually, like bacteria, are not included in the BSC. We are not even sure if asexual species form discrete clusters the way sexual organisms do. According to the biological species concept, a species is a reproductive community, aka gene pool, meaning that a species is an evolutionary community. This is only for species that are not asexual. If a good mutation crops up, it won't spread to other species, making the species a unit evolution that evolves. Members of a species look and behave alike because they respond to the same way to evolutionary forces. Lack of inbreeding maintains the differences in appearances, and behavior allows them to continue to diverge without limitations. BSC, no matter the fact that it is not perfect, is still preferred because it can explain how reproductive barriers evolve, thus explaining the origin of species. How do reproductive barriers arise? It is the combined effects of evolution and geography that create these barriers. An example is the monkey flower and its ancestor, because it evolved by divergent selection. It evolved by divergent selection because a mountain range could have formed and hummingbirds could have been pollinators for one particular side of the mountain. Hummingbirds on one side of the mountain could attract birds with red and give rewarding nectar. Flowers on the other side could have been pollinators that were bees, evolving in pink in color and having shallow nectar tubes for bee size. If the mountain was removed, both flowers would have reproductive barriers now and species would diverge. Another one of these barriers could be sexual selection by female preference. Sexual selection by female preference to male size or color could also diverge a species if they later encountered each other. They would not interbreed, and then they would be considered different species. Sterility and inviability of hybrids. Features could be accidental byproducts of genetic divergence. Divergence caused by natural selection or genetic drift. For example, if two geographically isolated populations evolve along different pathways long enough, their genomes can become so different that when they're put together in a hybrid, they just don't work well, causing a disruption in the development of hybrids to die prematurely or be sterile. Species don't arise. Nature doesn't need them. Species are evolutionary accidents instead. Clusters are simply the inevitable result of genetic barriers that arise when spatially isolated populations evolve in different directions. The theory of geographic speciation. It's the idea that geographic isolation is the first step in the origin of species. The evolution of genetic isolation between two populations requires that they be the first to be geographically isolated. This is important because without this isolation selection that could drive populations apart, it has to work against the interbreeding that constantly brings individuals together and mixes up their genes. Interbreeding will just keep making the population stay the same. How does speciation work? There's two ways that it can work. The first one is if speciation depends largely on geographic isolation, where there must have been lots of opportunities during the history of life for populations to experience that isolation. An example of this could be isolated formation of geographic barriers, or a long-distance dispersal like traveling birds in oceanic islands, like the Galapagos. The second way it could occur is geography by itself. If populations must usually be physically isolated from one another to become species, then we should find the most recently formed species in different but nearby areas. Another example again here is the Galapagos, where in the different islands there's different types of birds, but its closely related species is on the next island.
What is the evidence of geographic speciation? We know we have a common ancestor, but what actual evidence can we provide? In this case, we have the fossil record, embryology, and other data. Although there are some problems with speciation, for example, it takes too long. It takes about 100,000 to 5 million years to evolve to produce two reproductive isolated descendants. So a geographical isolation, it literally means isolated, like you're actually getting speciation by literally isolation. For example, like mountains, the glacier spread, desert, continent drifts, forests, and grasslands. For example, the Isthmus Island in Panama, which was developed about 3 million years ago, emerged land which separated the marine organisms. However, this accidental long-distance dispersal may occur. It's not anything new. DNA is used to go back in time to see similarities between species. For example, in the Isthmus Panama Island, it shows 7 species of snapping shrimp showing proof of speciation that has been physically isolated. Also, another example is the orchid in South Africa. I believe it's called Satyrium halakiki. They usually get pollinated by hawk moths and long-tongued flies. In order to attract these pollinators, the orchid has evolved long nectar tubes in its flower, or short nectar tubes for the other type of flies. Reproductive isolation is also a part of this speciation. We have 3 different types: the discrimination between pairs, sterility, and viability of their hybrids, which leads to genetic barriers between groups, because if it's strong enough, then it can prevent interbreeding. It takes about 2.7 million years in order for it to diverge. This is a byproduct of evolution. And sympatric isolation also contributes to this idea of speciation. However, sympatric isolation is a controversial topic. However, mathematics has proven sympatric speciation possible. However, it's through restrictive conditions that may be uncommon in nature. An example of sympatric isolation is the cichlid fish, which is also found in Africa. They become spatially separated, and each lake contains a different mini radiation of species, each of them descending from a common ancestor. One lake in Africa actually has 11 species, and they're all in the same place. And then there's also the polyploid speciation, which is a speciation created from the hybridization of two different species. We also need a different number of chromosomes in order for us to get a fertile offspring. Another example that's rare yet very common is the polyploid speciation, which does not require hybridization. All you really do need is an autopolyploid and another autopolyploid in order for you to get a fertile offspring. A polyploid can arise simply by doubling all chromosomes of a single species. This process is often called autopolyploid. An interesting fact is that if an autopolyploid mates with the original parental species, the offspring is sterile, so it has to be that combination of autopolyploid and another autopolyploid. The polyploid speciation is rare because in order for it to occur, you need a union of sperm and eggs with abnormally high numbers of chromosomes, which means that it's very rare to find this combination of chromosomes in animals. Plants are a perfect example of a polyploid speciation. However, there's also the sterile plants, which us humans create desirable genes combinations, which is why they're sterile. And some examples are like wheat, cotton, cabbage, chrysanthemums, and bananas. With that being said, mysteries of mysteries, Darwin quoted, referring to the origin of species, is no longer a mystery.